Hello and welcome to the Olive Tree Media webinar series. It's great to have you join us today and our first event for 2023. Today, Karl Faase is going to be joined by Reverend Dr. Michael Bird, and they'll be discussing the topic of religious freedom in Australia. It'll be surely a challenging and inspiring discussion, and we're really glad that you've joined us. My name is Ainsley Freeman, and I'm one of the team members of Olive Tree Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar event today. We welcome you from every lunchroom, office, church, school, home, across the country and beyond. And we're mindful of the traditional custodians of all these lands created by Almighty God and stewarded throughout generations. Now, there's a chat on the right-hand side window, and we would love for you to let us know where you're joining us today. And there'll be a Q&A later on, so be sure to put questions in the chat as we go. If you could just put a Q in front of your question, that will help us see and let Karl and Michael engage with those questions later on. And finally, I just want to let you know that as a thank you for joining us in this live webinar, we have an offer for you that will come up just before the Q&A. We're offering two of our books, our Faith Runs Deep anthology and Karl's Stuff of Life book, and they'll be packaged together in a webinar pack for just $25. So keep an eye out. There'll be a link that comes up in the chat, and Karl will let you know about that soon. So let me welcome Karl Faase, and we'll get started with this webinar.
Thank you, Ainsley, and it's fantastic to be here and to have all of you joining us from all over the country as we ask this question: is it reasonable and fair to contend for religious freedom in a secular age? Now, there's so much discussion going on about this, and there's a lot of people have registered for this webinar purely because this is such a key issue. As we said, as Ainsley's already said, be sure you join us in the chat. Later on, there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions, so you can put them in the chat and just let us know where you're from and where you're joining us from. We've got a whole bunch of people from Sydney. What a surprise. We've got people from Sydney. They're here as well. There's people from all over the place: Frankston, Perth, Central Coast, everywhere. I think there's even people from Melbourne, which will be Michael Bird will be incredibly pleased to know about. So I just want to take this moment to welcome Michael Bird and thank him for being with us, and thanks for being a part of this webinar, Mike. Let me introduce Reverend Dr. Michael Bird to you. He's the academic dean and lecturer in New Testament at Ridley College in Melbourne. He's the author and editor of over 30 books. But you might be a bit surprised to know a bit more about Michael's backstory. Michael, welcome to the webinar.
Karl, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's joining and listening in.
Now, would you want to make a note that Michael looks like he's coming from a cupboard? You actually had this very impressive little room that we had. What are you doing in a cupboard, man?
Yeah, well, it turns out there's some refurbishments happening at my house, and the electricians had to turn the power off, and it's pretty hard to do a online seminar with no electricity. So I've had to come down into an abandoned church office and set up a little makeshift studio here, but internet seems to be working fine.
I'll tell you, your personality fills the room. Who needs nice furniture, man? Michael, listen, if we met you at 17, you left school, here's everybody thinking you're the academic dean at Ridley College, written all of these books. What did you do as you come out of school?
Well, I mean, I wanted to write musical theatre for a living. That was my ambition in life. But what I actually ended up doing was joining the army when I was 17. And when I joined the army, I'm not joking, I weighed like 45 kilograms. I had the body of a scrawny chicken. And I just turned 17 and ended up becoming an infantry soldier, and then a paratrooper, then in military intelligence. And yeah, it was a big change in life. I mean, I couldn't get into university. My grades were not good enough. Really? And I really wanted to, I needed to get away from my family. I had a very dysfunctional family I needed to get away from, and the army was one way to do that.
People would be so surprised to hear that you kind of couldn't scrape up enough marks to get into a university course.
Yeah, I know, it's weird. Like, I've done invited seminars at Oxford, Cambridge. I've delivered lectures all around the world, and it turns out when I finished high school, I was basically like a C+ student. I was a C+ student. I got good grades, but for very easy subjects. Like we did a thing called Maths in Society, and if you could make a cube, you passed, and if you could color it in, you got extra grades. It was
Oh, right.
kind of like that. It wasn't kind of like cutting edge calculus, that sort of a thing.
What about at that period of time? Was faith a part of your life? Where was the Christian message story for you?
No, it wasn't there. I came from a very non-religious background, a very unchurched home. I could be a little bit antagonistic towards religion, and I just absorbed some of the tropes, from my parents, from the wider culture, that people of faith are all hypocrites, they're all weak-willed, they're all evil, that type of thing. And it was something really born of ignorance and prejudice. I didn't really know any Christians, but I knew that I was supposed to not like them.
Yeah. Wow. So you actually came across some, and it'd be great to spend the whole time talking about your story because it's so interesting. What was the thing that made the difference for you?
Well, again, actually meeting Christians. So I was living in Sydney in the army. I was kind of bored because it was just kind of like work. Go out and hit some bars and pubs, do more work. And after about 6 months of that, I was pretty bored. There's got to be more. And a guy I worked with invited me to church. I thought, got nothing else to do on a Sunday morning. So I kind of got up, and I was just expecting a room full of moralizing geriatrics, that kind of a thing. And I went along, and that's not what it was. It was a whole bunch of people, very diverse people, a very multicultural part of Sydney, from all different vocations, all parts of life. But they were brought together by their worship of God, and there was something different about them. They were not just nice. I knew nice people. There was something fantastically, weirdly good about them. And I found out what it was. They had a relationship with Christ, and for the first time I heard the good news of Christ, heard the gospel. And in 1994, I gave my life to Christ, and the world's been a different place ever since.
So, why academia? Like, given your grades at school and what you were doing, that sounds like a big step, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I did have a penchant for creative writing. So I like musical theatre. So every now and again, I will turn the Council of Nicaea into a rap battle, for something I do in class. So I've got this creative side, but also working in military intelligence, you're being saturated with information. You've got to take it all in, analyze it, and then you've got to write reports and give oral briefings in a very quick amount of time. So you're kind of, trained in how to absorb stuff and to then disseminate it out. And that gave me a good range of skills. And I initially thought about becoming an army chaplain. So I was going to, work as a chaplain in the Defence Force. But as I went through college, it became apparent to me that my skills were probably more academic than they were on the pastoral side. So, I got some good grades, did a few other advanced degrees, and kept doing reasonably well. And a few doors opened, and
that's fantastic.
Here I am.
But here you are. Listen, we're gonna come back to Michael in a minute and get into the question. But one of the things we wanted to let people know about is that we create numbers of series, and many people know about Jesus the Game Changer from a number of years ago. And then just last year released our new series called Faith Runs Deep. It was shot across Australia in the middle of COVID, so it had its challenges to produce this series. So as part of this webinar, we wanted to let you know about the series. So here's a video giving you a bit of a picture of Faith Runs Deep. Welcome to Faith Runs Deep. In this series, we're going to unearth stories of Christian faith that have helped shape our nation. You're going to meet people from history and people from today who are impacted by Christian faith and have gone on to influence our nation.
Australia lives off Christian capital to this day.
It was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
I went to church with my new friend Lisa and I heard the gospel. I heard about Jesus.
I thought, I don't care what it costs me, I'm going to see what these guys have got that I haven't got.
I believe when it comes to faith in this nation, that we're not dealing with a group of people who hate Christianity or hate God. We're actually dealing with people who don't understand Christianity, who don't understand who Jesus is and what he's done.
One day I heard his thump and there was a tree and it just fell over. It had rotted out right underneath. That's something that I don't think we want to see happen to our culture, because the deep roots of Christianity are really critical for the health of the nation.
Join us as we drive across Australia in an iconic Holden Ute to explore the stories at the heart of our culture and see how the followers of Jesus have influenced Australia. Join us on this journey as we discover where faith runs deep in Australia. So that's our new series, Faith Runs Deep, and make sure you get a copy of that. And there's ways that you can access that through our website, olivetreemedia.com.au. Now, we're talking to Michael Bird, who wrote this book, which is Religious Freedom in a Secular Age, which is the subject of today's discussion and the subject of this webinar. So Mike, let's start off with the word secular, because there's this notion that secular means, nothing Christian or nothing religious. Define secular for us.
Well, we could say that secular in its best sense means defining the space between areas of faith and in the areas where faith is not allowed to matter. So you could call that the separation of church and state. So secularism, as the idea of creating space for people, is about managing those differences that we have between religions, or creating space for people of all faith and none. And behind secularism, there's two basic ideas. There's number one, we're not going to live in a theocracy. So we're not going to replace the Governor General with an Ayatollah, a Pope, or a Dalai Lama. But here's the other side of it. Secularism means the government is not going to coerce you in matters of religion. It's not going to punish you because of your religion. So that's the two sides of secularism. We're not going to have a theocracy, and the government doesn't coerce you in how you do religion or punish you because of your religion.
And there's this idea that some great Christian thinkers actually gave the idea of being a secular nation to Western nations, and that was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of religious tolerance you can find in different civilizations, different empires. I mean, the Mongol Empire, despite all of its horrendous violence, they actually did practice a lot of religious tolerance. But secularism is about creating a legal framework where you can live with religious differences. I mean, and this really comes out of, the Reformation, where Europe was torn apart between Catholics and Protestants. And after things like the 30 Years' War, it's like, well, we can't just keep doing this over and over. We can't keep, punishing Catholics and Protestants and Catholics. We've got to come up with some way of living together. And what they came up with was a type of secular settlement. It's like, okay, we're going to have freedom of religion. You can be Protestant, you can be Catholic, but the reason we're going to do that is we're going to define certain spaces where sectarianism is not allowed to matter. So, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, you can go to a public school. Whether you're Protestant or Catholic, you can serve in government. But that framework for dealing with the Protestant-Catholic divide could then be applied to other religions. It could be applied to Jews. And to be honest, a lot of the Jewish communities, they got a hard time at the hands of European Christians. I mean, the Spanish kicked all the Jews out of Spain. And do you know where they went? They went to the Muslim Ottoman Empire because they were more tolerant than the Spanish Catholics. So rather than do something like that in a sort of, a Christified environment or Christendom, secularism meant you could live with differences between Protestants and Catholics and different Protestant groups, but you could also have tolerance of other religious minorities, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, or whoever. And that became a legal framework that could sustain religious freedom.
Yeah, and so in that setting, the idea of being secular is actually a good thing, a good thing for any nation. Define secularization, which tends to be something different.
Yeah, secularization, I would argue, is the more militant attempt to discourage or eradicate religion or restrict the number of areas where religion can be visible and where it can be influential. So you can see that, in a number of different cultures in a number of different ways. So, for instance, in the Soviet Union, churches were not allowed to be too visible. You couldn't display religious symbols in public, that kind of a thing. That's a secularization. That's the idea that religion is basically a bad thing that we'll only give the minimal freedoms to. But my point is secularism, in its best sense, protects you from secularization.
Yeah,
I mean, I know that sounds contradictory, but that's the basic idea.
So there's the idea that there's the realm of politics and there's the realm of faith, religion, and belief. How do they interact at best in a secular world?
Well, there's different views. Like the Anabaptist tradition is very much people of faith should have nothing to do with government. So you've got to retreat, do your own kind of monastic community, don't pay taxes, don't get benefits, just keep yourself completely separate. I mean, that's one view. But for most of us who live in liberal democracies, there's going to be some link between religion and politics. And that's because government enacts laws. Laws are based on policies. Policies are shaped by values, and values in turn are shaped by things such as religion. So there's always going to be a little bit of a connection between government and religion, and also people of faith on the left and the right can also stand for public office. There's no disqualification. So there's always going to be a little bit of a role, but what we want to make sure is that no one religion becomes hegemonic. No one religion is able to try eliminate the religions that they compete with or they don't like. You don't want Protestants getting rid of Catholics, Sunni Muslims getting rid of Shia Muslims, or atheists getting rid of Hindus, or whatever the situation is. And I should also say, church, even with a healthy separation of church and state can still cooperate in areas where they have common interests. So, the government can give money to the Salvation Army to run a drug rehab center, or you could have chaplains in the military, chaplains in hospitals, chaplains in the police force. So you can still have a healthy church-state relationship, even if you're conscious of keeping church and state a little bit separated because you want to avoid the religious sectarianism that characterized Europe and indeed other parts of the world even today.
What happens when politics tries to get, there's this notion that you said about religion dominating politics, some of those examples you gave. What happens when politics tries to dominate religion? What's the problem there?
Well, there's a whole bunch of problems, because that is an attack not just on religious freedom, it's also an attack on secularism. Because secularism, I said, it's got those two aspects. We're not going to live in a theocracy, but the other side is the government doesn't tell you how to do your religion, and it doesn't punish you or take punitive actions against your religion. The danger is that the government will want to try interfere in religious communities and tell them what to do. For example, if someone applies for a job to be a principal of a Muslim school, and let's just say that they don't go to the mosque, they don't even own a copy of a Quran, they run a website called, Bacon Lovers of Sydney, is that person really a Muslim? And if the Muslim community says, well, we're not really sure he's the best fit to be the principal of a Muslim school, and then the government says, well, eating bacon has nothing to do with being a Muslim, and they're then telling Muslims what it means to be a Muslim. And then you can apply the same thing about Catholics. Do you have to believe in Mary or the Pope to be Catholic? If the government says, well, you don't, that's got nothing to do with being Catholic. As long as you attend church once every now and then, or even just drive past the church every now and again, that's close enough to being Catholic. Because the danger is, once the government starts doing that, it goes down a dangerous path that then it gets asked to adjudicate on all sorts of weird things, such as, should we support a Calvinistic view of election or an Arminian view of election? Should we have Presbyterian government or congregational government? That's the problem. And for secularism to work, government must regard itself as incompetent to adjudicate in matters of religion. They've simply got to say, this is your own dispute. I mean, you can determine who is a Muslim in good standing with the Muslim community. We're not going to tell that for you. The danger today is I think governments do want a little bit, be a little bit intrusive in this area, particularly as it applies to education and in some cases the charity sector.
Is this drifting into what you've written about, which is civic totalism?
Yeah, it's partially that. Now, civic totalism, it's a big fancy word, that's described by the American political philosopher Stephen Macedo. And basically he says civic totalism is this. It's not completely a totalitarian setup, but basically the government says, you know what, we've got to make sure that everyone is on board with our goals. And the problem with religion is they think there's something more almighty than the state. But the state, we should be your Allah, your Yahweh, your Jesus, your Moses. We should be the highest thing you're trying to adore and cooperate with. And religion is a bad distraction from that. We should be, the greatest good, the highest ideal that you owe your obedience to. And you've got to try align your goals with our goals. And a state with that kind of attitude will then seek to coerce its citizens into directing their consciences, their lives, and their energies towards goals determined by such a state apparatus. So it's kind of like a soft totalitarianism. But it's called civic totalism.
Yeah. So tell us about confident pluralism then. So where does confident pluralism fit into that mix?
Well, confident pluralism is a concept from another American legal philosopher called John Inazu, and he argues, rather than this sort of soft totalitarianism, what we need to do is recognize that in a multicultural liberal democracy, we're going to have some very different ideas about what is the highest good. How do I pursue happiness? What's the nature, the limits of human freedom? And we've got to find a way to manage differences within diversity. So, we don't want to weaponize any of our beliefs and values against another minority group, whether that's a religious minority or a sexual minority or an ethnic minority, but we want to find ways in which we can live together in harmony. when I think of confident pluralism, I think of that wonderful verse from, I think it's Micah 4, where it says, and everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Okay, it's about recognizing that we live in diverse multicultural societies, and we've got to find the mechanisms so we can live together in peace. And when there are differences, we can resolve them without state persecution or without mob type of violence. And I think, if you know anything about other places in the world where there is state persecution, where there is mob violence against minorities, that's what we want to avoid, because a liberal democracy means that we're going to have maximal freedom for all our citizens so they can live together in peace and hopefully pursue common civic goals.
And look, we all know that, and there's lots of principals and school teachers and perhaps even board members of Christian schools that'll be listening to this webinar, Michael, because right now, while we've sort of thrown around some examples that might happen or might not happen, it's a very live issue in Australia right now, because you've got a bunch of schools wondering about whether they would be able to employ the people that they think is best for their school. Now, to do the devil's advocate thing, which is, really you're getting funds from the government that's helping you to fund your school. Therefore, we should be able to tell you that you need to be diverse and inclusive in all of your staff. And yes, your chaplain might need to be a Christian, but certainly a maths teacher doesn't need to be a Christian. And there's a lot of people around the country that kind of go, oh, that makes sense. Even Christians who don't want that to be the case feel like that's a reasonable argument. Why is that? What's the counter argument? Where do we step into this, given the context that you've said about a secular world?
Yeah, well, you can understand the argument, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and you've got to be responsible for how you use public money. So, I understand where they're coming from. But I always apply the shoe on the other foot argument, okay? So our our political class, they're allowed to discriminate in their hiring practices and to only employ people who maintain their beliefs and values. I mean, you could go up to like a Green senator and say, look, why does your media advisor have to be a member of your political party? I mean, all this person has to do is tell you to stand in front of this microphone, hand you a script, tell you when your next appointment is, or something like that. There's nothing greeny about being a media advisor. And you know what? We've decided there's a distinct lack of diversity in your office. So what we're going to do, we've decided we're going to force the Green senators to hire Lyle Shelton to be their media advisor. And he's a great guy. He's got a lot of media experience, very capable at his job, and he'll bring some diversity to your office. Now, Lyle, who don't know, for many of you don't know, is a former head of the Australian Christian Lobby. He's now working with Family First. I'm going to go on a limb and say, I don't think it would be a good idea to appoint him as a media advisor for the Greens, because he doesn't share a lot of their values. They don't share his. So to impose him would be bad. Now, again, it's the same, apply the same thing. Forcing a Christian, say a Muslim school, to hire a gay atheist as their principal, that's not going to create harmony, unity, and that kind of thing. It's going to alienate the school, the parents, the children, and it's going to create conflict. So this is the irony. The attempt to create homogeneity, to make everyone the same, actually breeds division. So what we should do is let the Jews Jew, let the Muslims, let the Catholics Catholic, find ways so we can maintain the integrity of our own identity, our religion and practices, so we can live together side by side. So rather than force, say, Christian schools to hire people who don't adhere to their values, but let me say, there are some grey areas here. There are admittedly grey areas, but in principle, rather than do that, I think what we're better off having is something like, imagine a Catholic school that lives side by side with like an LGBT legal advocacy centre, where they're both entities live side by side, no mutual hostility, no one wants to burn the other things down. The people see each other in the street, they wave and say hi. They have differences, but they can overcome their differences because of their commitment to living in peace with one another. That, I think, is a better option. That is confident pluralism, rather than forcing everyone to reorientate their values towards the goods, the ideals that are set by the state.
Now, I think if we listen carefully, Michael, we'll be able to hear the cheering across the nation as to what you said from people on our webinar. Why though? Because you hear in this context and you hear what you're saying, that makes perfect sense. Why would people push against that? Like, what's the counter argument to that?
Well, the counter argument is always that all discrimination is bad. Okay, so all discrimination is bad, but people tend to be very selective when they mean all discrimination. For example, if the government forced, the Sydney Gay Mardi Gras Committee to appoint a Catholic bishop onto their council, I'm pretty sure they'd be a little bit annoyed, and rightly so. So it's like discrimination is bad. Now, again, there are grey areas about this. What do you do with children at a school who are same-sex attracted? Should they be expelled? Now, pretty much every school principal I've met says no. They want to care pastorally for all the kids they have under their care. And we could have debates about, does every single job in a school need to have a religious requirement? So, I mean, there are some legitimate debates to be had. But the main thing we have to take away is that religious schools have the right to be religious. And that means they've got to maintain their religious identity and mission. And if the government wants to eradicate that, or to kind of, nullify that, it's going to run roughshod over our secularity, over the religious freedom of the Australian citizens, and it also would violate international standards of religious freedom. Because if you look at something like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18, which I really do recommend Googling, that talks explicitly about having, religious freedom in education, in community with others. And if you're going to start telling schools who can or cannot be a part of that community, then you're running roughshod over those basic and universal human rights as they pertain to religious freedom.
Yeah, the interesting thing that you see, especially I see this in the United Kingdom at the moment, where you actually have chaplains who make a Christian statement on the LGBTIQ plus community and then get sacked by the school. And there seems to be an interesting kind of space where you've actually got some schools who want to lean more to what the government think is a reasonable way forward through diversity and inclusion, as opposed to their foundational values.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the tension, the fact that religious groups and wider society have particular views about family, marriage, and sexuality, which, you know, does clash with the LGBT community. That is the real epicenter of our conflict. And we certainly don't want to empower or enable anything that would incite hatred or violence against LGBT people. But, you know, some people, Muslims have Muslim views of sex and marriage. Same with Catholics, same with Jews or Hindus. And as long as people are expressing their view in a civically responsible manner, or giving a religious view in a religious context, then it's pretty hard to find something wrong with that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll come back to I just want to, in a moment, this is the last question before we just remind people that you can ask questions, and I'll get a look at how I can see those questions for you as well, and we can ask them. So if you're on, put a Q in front of your question, just so that's obvious that it's a question for our team in the back room, to so we can ask Michael some questions from you as well. And I'll come back to something else in a moment. But Michael, I mean, one of the problems that we have at the moment, if I can frame it up as a problem, is that you have this notion that you know, you hold this view and I hold this view and we're all okay, which I guess is confident pluralism. But there's this notion that you can't hold that view, because if you do, therefore you're offending me. Yeah. And there's a really interesting thing. I mean, I know that in your book you have got this wonderful quote from Salman Rushdie that said, "There is no right in the world not to be offended." Interesting coming from Salman Rushdie, but where do we sit with that? Because there's a bunch of people where we just say, okay, here is a Christian worldview on sex and sexuality, and that's like, well, that's offensive, which becomes, you can't say that.
Yeah, I mean, and some people would go beyond offensive. Some would say it's flat out harmful, and that they would then say, and you're the reason why LGBT people are committing suicide. And they would lay it on rather thick. I mean, there's so many problems with that. I asked, well, what's the alternative? It's basically an Orwellian society where the government really determines which speech is acceptable or not. Now, free speech is not absolute. I believe there are limits to free speech, particularly if you're trying to incite hatred or violence against other people. There are limits to free speech. But, you know, saying things like, I regard your view as offensive is not a reason to shut it down. And the problem is, what you can infer next is not merely the expression of the view, the fact that people quietly hold that view, even if they're silent about it. You could say even that's a danger, because, and that's the next step. Once you say, well, it's wrong to express the view, you could then easily say, well, it's wrong even to privately hold that view. And you'd then be faced with the issue that, you know, the very existence of Jews, Christians, Muslims are an existential threat to, the LGBT community, and therefore, well, dark things come after the therefore. There are some people who tend to think that way. But I remember the time where we used to say things like, look, I profoundly disagree with what you said, but I will defend your right to say it. I mean, I remember those days, but we don't live in those days. It's kind of like, you know, I want freedom of speech for my side. I want to be able to go on Twitter and say J.K. Rowling should be murdered in front of her own children. I want the freedom to say that, but I don't think you should have the freedom to say that marriage should be between a man and a woman to the exclusion of all relationships. So people want an authoritarianism, but they want it to be very selective and distinctly tribal. And that's the real dangerous aspect.
We have a question from Warrenville Baptist Church, which is really on what you're saying, which is the question is about confident secularism. For it to work, how much does public discourse need to be censored? In other words, stopping hate speech. Now, you were just chatting about that, but is there a place for censorship? And like, what is it?
Well, I would say there is a place for censorship. We practice this in some aspects of our national security. You know, I've got like a military intelligence background, and we don't allow people to go blabbing around national secrets, that type of a thing. There are some things that can be censored in the context. But, you know, censorship, you need a really good reason to do it. And I don't like what you're saying is not a good excuse. I do think we can censor speech that is deliberately harmful, vindictive, or vitriolic. Now, regardless of where it's coming from. I can think of one particular left-wing comedian who said something about Andrew Hastie in WA. And this was a guy who championed the idea of diversity and inclusion, but he was literally using the language of sexual violence as to what should happen against a member of parliament. I would argue that speech like that should be censored, because if once you start using the language of violence and sexual violence against other human beings, I don't mind a little bit of censorship on that. Otherwise, people can start acting on it. But the idea, I'm just offended by what you say. No, I don't think that's a good enough reason for censorship.
I remember there's a little throwaway phrase, which was hate speech is not just speech that you hate. Like, so, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
We've lost. It is a problem with our Western democratic nations, as good as and wonderful as they are. We tend to have we seem to have a generation of tended to lost the idea of contending on intellectual concepts and ideas. They're all suddenly weaponized. I just want to mention, if you want Michael's book, go to Kurong. That's a great place to get it. We were going to get a box from Michael, but he doesn't have one. So go to Kurong and get a copy of his book. Really well worth reading. But also we have a special offer that Ainsley mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today. So the anthology, so this is 24 stories out of Faith Runs Deep. So this anthology and also my book, the Stuff of Life. Now we'll give you both of those for $25. There's a code that's going to be put up on the chat and information. So if you want to take up that special offer, the 24 stories. And by the way, this is a beautifully attractive book with it's kind of a coffee table book, and it's got great stories, fabulous stories of faith out of our series Faith Runs Deep. And this book, The Stuff of Life, has absolutely zero pictures, but it's a great book. So $25, go on to code and get those books. And don't forget to go to Kurong if you want to get onto Michael's book. Here's Stephen Tuck, is a guy I know. Stephen, great to have you on the webinar. He said, how should a Christian chaplain or Christian school chaplain, you know, say an army chaplain or school chaplain, how should they answer the question, do you support same-sex marriage?
Well, they should answer honestly. You know, that may well be something like, do you support, you know, some will just say yes, some will say no, some will want to say yes, but, or no, but. You know, what a chaplain in the military would probably say something like this, you know, out of my religious conviction, no, I do not personally support same-sex marriage, but I am still your chaplain, and I'm here to walk with you, you know, from basic training through the darkest heart of war, and I will be with you the whole way, praying for you, holding your hand, offering a shoulder to cry on if you ever need me. Okay. That's what I imagine a military, even one who's religiously very conservative, would say. Okay. So, you know, they've still got to exercise their job as a chaplain to all the people who serve in the Australian Defence Force.
Yep. So we've got Mel McCann who talks about hate speech and bigot get thrown around as soon as one expresses a view contrary to what other people think. What really constitutes hate speech and a bigot in our modern world? You kind of talked about that from a hate speech point of view. The term bigot, I mean, that, you know, anybody that's in Christian leadership, like you or I, Michael, and lots of people on this webinar are probably a bit over the word bigot, which is basically anybody that disagrees with you. Is there such a thing as a bigot? What is it?
We used to think of bigotry as things like where there was demonstrable prejudice. So, for example, I wouldn't want to sit next on a bus next to a black person. I mean, I would call that bigotry. Whereas now people think bigotry is like, hey, that lady goes to a Methodist church, that makes her a bigot. So, I mean, you've got to kind of differentiate the, you know, what I think is real bigotry from simply the people just yelling very loudly or writing in caps lock on social media that anything they don't like is bitter. I mean, it's like the word Nazi now is no use so broadly to be practically ridiculous. In Melbourne this week, we had a women's rights protest, not an anti-trans protest. I'd call it a women's rights protest. Unfortunately, some very despicable characters dressed in black clad and with balaclavas did come along and were doing their act, but they tried to pin that on the women's rights protest, as if these two things were the same thing. And you had both sides of the political spectrum, the premier and the opposition leader, men attacking, calling women Nazis because they did their women's right protest, and some bad hombres rocked up in the same social space. So I mean, that's the type of thing that's not helpful. It's just trying to slander people with the most extreme ideology, even if they don't necessarily resemble it in any way.
Yeah. I mean, Addie Patterson, and I'm sorry, Addie, I'm trying to get your question right. It's could you explore pluralism at the level of individuals, small self-organized groups, and social institutions and government? Where does pluralism evaporate and power relations appear?
That sounds like a good political philosophy question. Yeah, well, pluralism, I would argue, is the ability to live with differences. We can have political differences. Yep. We can have economic differences. We can have religious differences. We can have ethnic differences. So pluralism is about being able to live with difference. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the things that enable you to do that are things like secularism. We're not going to privilege one religion, and we're not going to punish some religion. Things like an independent judiciary. Okay, everyone has equality before the law. Those are tools that enable us to be pluralistic in the best sense, and it means we can be united by certain understandings of a common good, like those basic freedoms, rather than being a society that's united only by ethics and religion, or only united by geography.
A really hot topic that's happening at the moment, and Andrew is asking, and I'm not sure how much you're across the detail of this, Michael, but what's your response to the recommendations of the ALRC, Religious Education and Discrimination Laws? Now, this is an organisation put together by the government who are recommending to the government, apparently Christian schools, peak organisations have actually stopped dealing with the ALRC because they don't like the direction that their recommendations are going. What's your thoughts there? What is the Australian Law Reform Commission, and what's your thoughts about where that's heading?
The Australian Law Reform Commission advises government on complex legal matters. The legal matter they were asked to deal with is how do we deal with that problem about religious schools? How do you say, look, discrimination against LGBT people is bad, and yet these religious schools, Christians, Jews, Muslims, have religious beliefs about family, sexuality, and marriage, and how does that relate to the way they treat their own students and their hiring and firing policies? So that was the task, and that is a legitimate task because it is a complex topic where we have two good things, non-discrimination and religious freedom. These are two good things, but they've come into conflict with each other. So how do we resolve a conflict between two good things? Unfortunately, the Australian Law Reform Commission, from which I can only assume possibly needs a refund on their law degrees, because it wasn't the worst case scenario, but it was the second worst case scenario. And that they're making some, how can I put it, some very creative suggestions as how we can resolve those differences. And they don't end well either for secularism, okay, or for religious freedom. So let me give you just two examples of why I think it's an absolutely bad document. The document ends and begins by mentioning, remember that thing I said, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? The document begins and ends by mentioning it, but mentioning in the sense of how can we get around it? So the document begins and ends with the explicit purpose of trying to circumvent international human rights law as it pertains to religious freedom. So it says, people have got religious freedom in education, but, or people have the right to practice religion in community with others. But do they really? So it kind of begins on ends on pretty bad footing. And then it makes some of the most preposterous suggestions. It says, okay, look, a religious school could compel an LGBT faculty member to teach, say, a Muslim view of sex and marriage. Okay, so you could compel a gay man or woman to teach a Muslim view of sex and marriage on the condition that the LGBT person would then be free to teach their view of sex and marriage to the students. Now, I actually discussed this with a with a gay man who's married to another man. And I said to him, "Would you like to be forced by your employer to teach a Muslim view of family and marriage, to students? Would you like to be your employer could force you to do that?" And they're like, "Heck no, I don't want to do that." And do you think the parents of kids in a Muslim school want to be taught at their school an LGBT view of family, marriage, and sexuality? And he thought, well, obviously not. So it was literally a suggestion that it would be harmful, or maybe not harmful, but it would alienate and annoy the LGBT community involved in education, and it would also annoy and really get up the nose of religious communities and religious schools. So it just sort of, quite frankly, bizarre suggestions. I wonder, with someone interning at a legal firm dreamed up while they were in the shower one day, because I don't have any other explanation of how you could come up with something that will literally offend everybody when the purpose, your remit, was to try to find ways to solve differences. So it's a terrible document. Again, I mean, they're trying to do their best, but I think they're ignorant about international standards of law. They don't know anything about religious communities. All they've got to go on, I think, is a couple of articles they've read in The Guardian, and that's pretty much the basis of which they're trying to do a reconciliation between non-discrimination principles and religious freedom. So write to your, or you can read it, write to your local member, federal member, and tell them this is a really flippin' bad thing. And the Australian Law Reform Commission, a great organisation, needs to go back to the drawing board and get some competent people who actually know what they're talking about.
Michael, that's looking at the kind of government side, and I guess the community side. David Brager, great friend of Olive Tree Media, is asking, what mistakes have we made in our church culture that's exacerbated this situation, and what should we be doing differently now to avoid it? So if we're looking at the ALRC and saying, well, that's a really unhelpful. Looking at the church culture,
okay. The number one, I mean, everyone is operating out of fear, and fear leads to hatred. Okay, so on the LGBT side, and look, I'll be honest with you, some LGBT people have had some very bad experience at the hands of people of faith. Okay, and there's a lot of hurt, a lot of harm, and that's generated hate towards people of faith. Okay, so we've got to remember that we can complain about sort of the rainbow lobby, but at the sometimes, to an extent, I think we are responsible for what's happened there. We've got to bear that in mind. And therefore, when we address this issue of religious freedom and LGBTI people, we've really got to speak with love, with compassion, and say, look, we do have some differences, but I don't want to go on some kind of violent purge and eradicate you. I do accept non-discrimination against all people is a good principle. All I'm saying, I don't want to impose Catholic bishops on the, LGBT legal committee, and I don't want to enforce, LGBT people on the Muslim high school as well. Let's define spaces where we're not going to alienate each other. So I do think we need a lot more wisdom and a lot more compassion, because we are interested in, like I said, secularism in the best sense, pluralism in the best sense. And the problem is, though, when you get an incident such as happened at City Point Church in Brisbane, okay, where they've produced a document that was effectively imported out of the United States from an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, and then just sort of dropped that into everyone's email on 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, at the same time where the country is debating an anti-religious discrimination bill. Yeah, that's not going to help the cause. That's not going to help the cause. I think there were some epic mistakes made at City Point, and that basically affected the whole conversation, because for the LGBT lobby, they could see the statement made by City Point, the document they produced, as the sum of all the things they were warning about. Okay. And I think it was constructed in such a way that did not fit for the Australian context. And it did not quite work in a way of communicating that we harbor no ill will towards LGBT people. And we're, I mean, I know a lot of very conservative people in Christian schools. They don't walk around every day plotting how they can hurt and harm LGBT students. They know that they do have gay students. They do have students wrestling with gender dysphoria, and they want to have pastoral care for them. Yeah. That's what we need to communicate. Okay. There may be points where we say, well, this is the bit where we can agree up to this point, but up to here, we just have to agree to disagree, and you're allowed to your view and I'm allowed to my view, and let's define the spaces where we get to hold those views. But we need to do that.
How do we help? How do you think, is there any way we can help the community agree to agree to disagree? Because it seems to me that that's becoming the crux of a lot of the issues, isn't it? You can't agree to disagree anymore.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing: agreeing to disagree is boring. Treating your opponents with respect will not get you headlines. The people who get the headlines are the angriest, the nastiest, the extremists. They're the ones who get the headlines. They're the ones who get the most Twitter followers. And this is the thing: the more hateful you are towards, say, people of faith, the more likely you are to get your own talk show on SBS, okay, or at The Guardian, and that door swings the other way. The more right wing you are, the more abrasive, the more antagonistic you are to some people, the more likely you are to get your own talk show on Sky News. I mean, so that door swings both ways. The system that the media does not reward sensibility, compassion, and moderation, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, interesting, Michael. There was a joke on the panel a couple of weeks ago in the middle of the World Pride, and it was an appalling joke. And I think anybody of that's reasonable would describe that as an appalling joke about Jesus. Now, I know it's an enormous surprise to you that I made a comment on Twitter about that, Michael. And some of the pushback was kind of what we were just talking about. The pushback was, well, he's been harassed as a homosexual man by people who call themselves Christians, so that makes that okay. And I'm like, there's a technical term for that, isn't it? It's called gaslighting. It's not my fault, it's your fault. But there's an interesting balance there, isn't there?
Well, I mean, there's the two things here. One is freedom of speech.
Yep.
Do people have the freedom to mock religion?
Yeah.
I would say yes, but here's the thing. But whether people want to promote it is another thing. And I think was it Channel 9?
I think it might have been 10.
I think on Channel 10. Yeah, that's right, Channel 10. And I think Channel 10 eventually did realize that they came to the right view. So I don't want to ban mocking religion, because otherwise you end up with a kind of like blasphemy laws. Okay, I'm very happy for people to make jokes about me, that type of thing, or about other people's religions as well. So even if it makes me cringe and makes me a little bit grumpy, again, I've got to accept the fact that people can have joke, even distasteful tussed at my expense, because the opposite is blasphemy laws. But whether people want to platform it in the interest of creating a pluralistic, wholesome democracy where we don't want to antagonize each other, where we don't want to create them and us, that's the other question. So you're free to do that stuff, but whether you want to platform it, well, you're the one who can live with the consequences as to whether you're promoting real bigotry and you're attacking our multiculturalism, our secularism, and our pluralism.
There's Matt's come through, and this is probably our last question. Why don't governments acclaim the great and good service that faith communities do in society? It seems that Matt's suggesting it's a topic that's never really dealt with, and there's almost this notion that all the good that churches do, what we hear about is why aren't they taxed more, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and it depends who you ask. I remember there was a Labor politician who was on the far left. But one of his comments was, he says, I've traveled into some of the biggest hellholes around the world, on fact-finding missions. And everywhere I go, I find either Caritas, a Catholic charity, Southern Baptist groups, or, you know, Christian World Aid or something. He says, wherever I go to these miserable places like famine in Africa, war in Cambodia, I find these Christian groups. And he says, and that's why I have to keep reminding myself, you know, because he reads his social media stuff and like, you know, all Catholics are just, you know, clones of George Pell, therefore they're all evil. But I've got to remember about that, you know, 80-year-old nun I met in Cambodia, or I've got to remember about that 21-year-old you know, Presbyterian African I met in the Sudan. Some of our members, I think, do know it because they're out in the community and they do meet the various groups. And I like to think that does make them modulate even their hostility somewhat. But the problem is on places like social media or the general media, that doesn't come through. You know, when people look at the Catholic Church, they don't look at, you know, the Catholic tradition of socialism. There is a big tradition of Catholic social teaching that is a little bit social. No one remembers that. All they think about is, you know, the George Pell case, or they only remember the Israel Folau case. And that's, I think, something the nature of the media. You know, again, the media feeds off hostility. It feeds off tensions. That's what gets clicks. That's what gets subscriptions. And the whole thing, this is the downside of a free media. It is monetized towards creating and breeding conflict.
Yeah. Michael, it's been fantastic. I want to remind everybody. So Michael's book, Religious Freedom in a Secular Age, which we've been chatting a bunch of quotes out of the book, really worthwhile reading if you haven't read it. And especially if you're in the Christian school sector, make sure you get a read of that. Available at Kurong. Our special offer where we got the anthology and the Stuff of Life, $25. Just go to the link and you get that special price for both of those. I want to let you know that the next time we're going to get together for our webinar, we've got Karen Wilson who's going to join us. She's the president of the Baptist World Alliance for Women, worked extensively with the global leadership across the world, and great lady. And she's going to be with us on the 31st of May, so don't miss that. And the only problem with the 31st of May is that we can't have Michael on again because you've been fantastic. Michael, thank you. Really appreciate your time with us, your input, your reading, your books, and we really appreciate that you're not in the military intelligence anymore, but in faith intelligence, and that's a great boost for the church and for the gospel and for the kingdom of God. So Michael, thank you. If you could hear the cheers, I think I can hear them now coming to you for your great work. So thank you very much, and thank you all of you for being with us. Make sure you go through the offers, look up Faith Runs Deep. We trust as you navigate your way through these incredibly difficult issues, you'll keep what Michael said in mind. You'll be a people of grace and dignity and faith, that you'll treat people with grace and dignity, and who knows what God's going to do through our nation. We look forward to seeing you guys again on the 31st of May. Otherwise, thank you for being with us for this webinar.